There is a lot of hate swirling around quarterback Justin Herbert after the disastrous loss on Saturday, and some fans are even starting to wonder whether or not he has that dog in him.
You are Locked On Chargers, your daily podcast on the Los Angeles Chargers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, and welcome into the Locked On Chargers podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Wade, joined as always by my co-host, David Droegemeier, and we've been covering the Chargers together now for 9 seasons, but this is our 7th year as the host of the Locked On Chargers podcast, bringing you your team every day. Thank you to the everydayers out there for making us your first listen. To make sure that you never miss the show, go subscribe or follow for free on the Locked On Chargers YouTube channel and listen wherever you get your podcast from. David, what do we got today?
Daniel, after Justin Herbert's performance in the wild card game, there are some fans out there that are questioning whether Justin Herbert has that dog in him. Well, I'm here to tell you he absolutely does, and that is complete nonsense. And could Greg Roman be offensive coordinator for the Chargers for only 2 seasons? There's some fans out there that are already calling for his head, and the Chargers, after that performance, have some glaring weaknesses. What are some of the biggest ones that they need to address before next season?
Yeah, that one is hard to whittle down a little bit, but I think we all saw the weaknesses exposed in that last game. But today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. David, it is Buy or Sell Tuesday, meaning we have to get into the biggest Charger storylines and overreactions. And after a disaster like the one we saw on Saturday, there's going to be a lot of overreactions flying around. And there's some really big storylines, honestly, that have to get addressed. But there has been a lot of questioning of Justin Herbert after a terrible performance, obviously. And I think there's one kind of overlying factor that many fans have wondered at certain times. And this one, for sure, definitely thinks that Justin Herbert may be missing something as far as being able to get this team over the hump.
This is Big EV, and Buy or Sell. Stevie Wonder can see Justin Herbert's talent. But I'm starting to wonder if the dude has the dog in him enough to win a Super Bowl. Buy or sell. Does Justin Herbert need more dog in him to be able to get this team over the top? I see the dog in Bo Nix. I see the dog in Jaden Daniels. I see the dog in Lamar. I see the dog in Josh Allen. I see the dog in Mahomes and all those guys, Joe Burrow. But the one thing I question, not the talent, but does he have that dog in him to win a Super Bowl? What say you guys? Thanks.
This is a tough one, David, because unfortunately, dog is a hard thing to quantify, right? I mean, it depends what your kind of definition of it is, but I do think it's something like Justin Herbert's not a fiery guy, but I think it would be too far to say that he doesn't have that dog in him, especially after what we've kind of see him play through and put on display in years past.
Yeah, I mean, this is absolutely ludicrous to me. Justin Herbert, in his very first start in the NFL, knocked a defender out cold on the sideline by finishing a hit. Okay, this is a guy who's played through fractured rib cartilage that would put most people out for the season, and he did not miss a game. Okay, he's played through torn labrums, broken fingers, plantar fascia injuries, bum ankles, torn labrums, you name it. This guy has braved through it all. Bad offensive lines, no running games, no defenses, and still has been able to power and lift his team through wins throughout all of that adversity. So to sit here and question whether he has that dog in him, whether he has that fight in him, I think that is completely insane. He absolutely has that dog in him. He just needs more dogs around him.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Like I said, I understand it from the standpoint of Justin Herbert doesn't have that super fiery attitude. But I think the other important part of that specific voicemail to point out is all those dudes you said have that dog in them. Only one of them has been dog enough, according to your standard, to win a Super Bowl, and that's Patrick Mahomes. Look what happened to Bo Nix. Where was the dog in that playoff game, right?
6 points.
Jaden Daniels definitely has that dog in him. I mean, he's played exceptionally, right? But he does not have a Super Bowl, nor does he have more than one playoff win. Obviously, Justin Herbert doesn't have that. But he has a lot going on around him too, and he's been awesome. But I think the other part of that is like Josh Allen has plenty of dog in him. Joe Burrow has plenty of dog in him. Lamar Jackson, plenty of dog. No one's questioning those things. None of those guys have won a Super Bowl. I mean, hell, the Chargers had maybe the fieriest, most dog quarterback in NFL history with Phillip Rivers.
Yeah.
Did he not have enough dog in him to go win a Super Bowl, right? Like, to me, dog is is your guy willing to stand in there and take a big hit and deliver a throw down the field? Is he going to have a big run when his team needs a jump and go lower his shoulder into Tyrann Mathieu and show his team, hey, it's time to get going, right? Did he have the dog in him when he had the shovel pass to Hassan Haskins to ice the Broncos in that game? Did he have that dog in him in Tennessee when he told the coaches, F it, give it to me, I'll get it in the end zone myself? Or did he have that dog in him when he played the Bengals and they needed him on that last drive and he stood in there and hit 2 big throws to Ladd McConkey on the game-winning touchdown drive? Like, it's so short-sighted. The most dog in him game maybe I've ever seen from a quarterback was 2021 Chargers versus Raiders Week 18, where that dude literally left his soul out on the field that day trying to get that win, and they still blew it, right? I think he has plenty of dog in him. I don't think that's the problem. Like, do I wish he was more like Phillip Rivers? Do I wish he was more rah-rah sometimes? Sure, right? Yeah. But, like, Baker Mayfield has plenty of that. He didn't win a playoff game this year either. So, like, it's just, I think it's kind of selective over, what is considered dog. He just had a bad game, right? And I think that's being overblown.
Recency bias is a hell of a drug, huh?
I think you've heard from all of his teammates, right, that they would go to battle for him, and they're not questioning the dog that he has inside of him. But let's get to this next one here from Money Python, who has maybe an even bigger overreaction, and it's this. Buy or sell, if Justin Herbert doesn't win a playoff match or even gets to the playoff next season, the next season could be the last one as a Charger for him. So let me say, obviously, with the context we don't have yet, right? If they don't make the playoffs, if he doesn't win another playoff game, that's something to address then. I mean, it's hard to kind of put ourselves in that shoe, not knowing what happened in that game or any of the other things you would need to know. But this isn't a crazy sentiment, and it's not something I haven't seen on social media, which is just people being done with Justin Herbert. I get it, man. Like, I get it was a bad game, but, like, let's not act like he was terrible against the Jaguars in that 27-0 game either, right? Like, he put up 30 points, which should have been 33 if not for a Cameron Dicker missed field goal, and his defense with a defensive coach blew a 27-point lead, partially because they had no running game to actually ice that game.
Yeah, go look at the rushing yards in the second half of that game.
Justin Herbert didn't turn the ball over a single time in that game, right? And they still lost. But if you need more kind of evidence about the grass being greener, ask a Raiders fan how easy it is to find a franchise quarterback. Ask a Giants fan. Ask a Bears fan. Ask a Jets fan. Ask a Colts fan. The list goes on and on. You've had it really great. You went from Drew Brees to Phillip Rivers to Justin Herbert. That's not normal. And most teams go a long, long time. Like, it might be 20 years before you ever find a quarterback as good as Justin Herbert if you move on from him. So I would tell you, hey, it's not great. He didn't have a good team, and he needs more help than what he had. Sure, he might not be able to elevate his team like a Josh Allen can at this point, or even a Lamar Jackson can at this point. That doesn't mean he's not a great quarterback, and I think if he had a better team, I don't think we see the result we saw on Saturday, and I don't think we're going to see that result going forward.
There's about 25 teams that would drop their quarterback right now for Justin Herbert. No questions asked, and would be absolutely over the moon, overjoyed to have him in the building. Okay, let's remember that. Let's remember that this guy is definitely still one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. Did he have a bad game? Absolutely, he had a bad game. But also, let's not forget here, he's signed to a $260 million contract. So trying to get out of that contract. That hasn't even started yet. It would be completely like suicide to the organization. It's just something that can't happen. They can't do it right now. It's just not something that's plausible. It's just not something that's going to happen, period.
Yeah, it's not going to happen, nor should it happen, right? Like, worse quarterbacks have won Super Bowls than Justin Herbert, obviously, right? Trent Dilfer's won a Super Bowl. Like, there's other guys that the corpse of Peyton Manning won a Super Bowl. A lot of it has to do with how good your team is. And sometimes you get a Tom Brady or a Patrick Mahomes that can supersede what he has around him and go win games in Super Bowls anyways. But that's not the norm. Justin Herbert is plenty good of a quarterback to win a Super Bowl if he had a Super Bowl team around him. And I don't think anyone is looking at the 2024 Chargers roster and thinking that's a Super Bowl team. The Chargers ceiling in this playoffs was one win and either probably losing to the Chiefs or in a different universe, losing to the Bills or the Ravens, and maybe even getting blown out in those games too, because those teams were just a tier above them, right? When Justin Herbert has a team around him that is comparable to the teams he's going to be going up against in the playoffs, then I think you could be really critical if he is the reason they lost, even though he had a good team. He was the reason they lost this last game, in part for trying to overcompensate for the bad team that he had around him, period, end of story. Justin Herbert is still one of the best quarterbacks in the league. He has a 2-game playoff sample size. One, he was okay. The second one, he was bad. So was Lamar Jackson. So was Peyton Manning. A lot of guys have had rough starts and have to kind of work their way through it. We'll see what happens in 2025 and going forward. But a big reason that the Chargers offense disappeared, not just in this game, but also this season, falls on the lap of offensive coordinator Greg Roman, who we've had our issues with, but we know he's sticking around in 2025. But how long will it last? How long is that leash? We're talking about that and more in today's Locked On Chargers podcast. This is a message from sponsor Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back, and then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives you your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find you every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy, all so you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now this is Taxes. Get an expert on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service. Real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. Dave, we have more to get into on this buy or sell Tuesday, and honestly, we got so many good buy or sells today, and I know everyone has a lot of storylines and overreactions going around that we'll try to repurpose some of these that we got today for later on in the week because there's a lot to discuss. But I do want to touch on this one that we have here, which I think is a sentiment that maybe a lot more fans have than just Mark S. here, who says, buy or sell, Greg Roman's last year as Chargers OC will be 2025. David, are you buying or selling that?
I have a really hard time buying this one just because of the relationship and connection that Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman have formed and formulated over several different stops together. You know, this has not been the first time, this is the third time that they've paired up, together, as a coaching staff. So it just, for me, I don't see it. I don't think it's going to end. However, they need to take a very deep look at what this offense looked like because, it's 19th in passing yards. It's 19th in receiving yards. It's 17th in rushing yards. And I think that's the biggest, most glaring issue for a Greg Roman-led offense, which, we talked about and lauded before the season started how impressive it was that he was able to author these top 10 rushing attacks like clockwork, like nobody's business, like it was just something that was automatic. That didn't happen this year, and it wasn't that close either. And there's so many more games that ended with less than 60 rushing yards than games that had over 100 rushing yards. It was a very, very, very bad performance from that aspect. And, when you're coming back, into the NFL after being fired for having some questionable passing concepts, you didn't really do a whole lot to answer the bell. We saw a couple of nice bells and whistles here. I think the touchdown to Ladd McConkey, which was against the Raiders, was a nice call. But there's only a couple that I can really think of that were decent. Outside of that, it was a lot of plays that had me scratching my head.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I think when you look at this team and you see what they were able to do this year offensively, there was frustration throughout the year, and they just ended on a very good note, right? Like, I think that was kind of what skewed things a little bit, is just because it's like they, just didn't perform when they needed it most, and maybe that's not super surprising. But what kind of scares me more is just kind of the history of Greg Roman and what he's been able to do in the playoffs, especially recently, right? When he had in 2019 MVP Lamar Jackson, they weren't good. Like this isn't the first time he has struggled specifically in the playoffs. I mean, when he was the Ravens OC, they made the playoffs 3 times, and it went like this. They were 1-3, and Lamar had offenses that were pretty bad in those games. This is what they scored: 17, 12, 20, and 3. One of those was a win, right? They still got a win. They scored 20 points in that game, but 4 games where you're not eclipsing 20 points with Lamar Jackson, I mean, now seeing what he's been able to do without him is pretty damning. And I'd also say in those games, it's important to mention, right, 3 touchdowns and 5 interceptions, and he completed under 56% of his passes. 5 interceptions in 4 games and less than a touchdown a game for Lamar Jackson throwing the football in those games. But I don't know, man. Like during the San Francisco run, they had a pretty good offense, right? They put up 28 points or more 4 different times in the playoffs when they were under Greg Roman in San Francisco with Alex Smith and Colin Kaepernick. And I think the question is now is, okay, does that still work, right? Does that style still work? But I think for this team, like the problem is just the bad play calls in big moments. That 4th and 2 call was just insane, right?
Awful.
Couldn't consistently push the right buttons this season to kind of get the offense out of a funk when he needed to. Couldn't push the right buttons to consistently work around the flaws in this offense. And if we're going to say the flaws in the offense for Justin Herbert, this was a flawed offense from Greg Roman. I think what you saw, though, was he didn't have the playmaking to feel like he consistently got the most out of the players he had out there outside of Ladd McConkey, right? Outside of Ladd McConkey, I don't know who you would look at and say he got the most out of that offensive weapon, right?
Maybe Will Dissly.
Yeah, Will Dissly for sure, but it's just hard to even say Will Dissly's name right now with a straight face.
I know.
So I get it that, the frustrations are boiling over. And, when you have Jim Harbaugh saying, I'm like Moses, I'm going to die leaning on my staff, it's worrisome. But he did fire some coaches, OCs in his time at Michigan. He parted ways with some different guys there and tried out different things there. You'd have to hope, hey, if they're still struggling, like they're probably going to be a pretty good team next year. They're going to have a better personnel. And I just don't think there will be as much for Greg Roman to hide behind under, in that. I mean, they didn't have more, 100, or they had more 100-yard games than 60-yard games, but I think it was 6 games of 61 yards or less for a Greg Roman team.
It just felt that way.
It felt definitely like that for sure. But we do have another voicemail here about maybe if Greg Roman is the biggest weakness, but what are the biggest weaknesses for this team right now?
Hey, this is Kirk in Eagle, Nebraska. Appreciate all you guys do, and all you guys have done this year. Thanks a lot. Hey, I was listening to Bill Cowher, and he mentioned that your strengths get you to the playoffs, your weaknesses get you out of the playoffs. So, hey, my question is, what do you think the biggest weaknesses for next year are for this Chargers team? My vote is offensive coordinator, but we'll see what you guys think. Bye.
Well, we talked about the offensive coordinator, right? And that is, in my mind, a weakness. I don't think he's an above average play caller in the NFL right now. Maybe at one point he was considered that. I don't think right now you would consider him that. But we just talked about that. So I'd rather focus, I guess, on the personnel parts of things, especially on the offense, David, where I think that like what the biggest weakness is for this team right now was wholly exposed. And that to me is just the supporting cast that surrounds Justin Herbert right now.
Well, yeah, I mean, look at the stats of the wild card game. It's insane. It's Ladd McConkey with almost 200 receiving yards, and then
everyone else.
I think the next person had 14. It's
just Will Dissly, right 2 catches for 16 yards was the next best.
16 yards after Ladd McConkey. That right there is obviously the biggest issue with the Chargers offense, and that's showed up a lot this year. And yeah, you had a couple of guys that stepped up here and there, but they where nobody was able to provide that consistent, play week in, week out besides Ladd McConkey. So got to get more explosive at the wide receiver position. Got to get somebody that can really, take the top off and really do some damage. And then obviously you need more from your tight end position as well. That's another offensive skill position. And then the other one is glaringly obvious as well, which is something the Houston Texans did a great job of exploiting, which is the interior of the Chargers offensive line. Those are the positions that, and I mean all of those positions, both guard spots and the center spot all need to be upgraded. All of those positions need to be upgraded completely because they weren't good enough. And I think that, that statement from Bill Cowher rings very, very true. And the Texans did a great job of pushing all the right buttons.
Yeah. And I don't even think it was just in the Chargers game where you saw what he said come to fruition. I mean, look what happened with the Vikings and the Rams, right?
Yeah.
Like Vikings were good all season long. And when they had, 2 kind of borderline playoff games to play, that last game against the Lions and this game against the Rams, all of their weaknesses were exploited. And that's what happened, right? Same with the Broncos who were scrappy and got there. I mean, Steelers just started happening much before that, but I think you saw that throughout the playoffs where, Packers, another good team, dark horse team, and then they kind of got exploited in the playoffs because of their weaknesses. So your weaknesses will have a spotlight shined on them when the time comes for the brightest lights to be shined upon your team. And I just think you look at this Chargers offense, right? And I think you have 4 foundational pieces with Justin Herbert, Ladd McConkey, Rashawn Slater, and Joe Alt. And I think there's a very good argument to make that you don't have an above average player at the other 7 positions on your offense.
That's fair.
And I just think there's just too much of a drop off. Like there's too many weak links. Like if it was just Zion Johnson and a strong center and a strong guard next to him, maybe you can get away with that, right?
Well, yeah, you saw what that looked like already.
If you had two, one great wide receiver and a great receiving tight end, maybe you can get away with that if you have average guys with them. But I think the problem is like in that game, you couldn't even get average play out of anyone that wasn't named Ladd McConkey. Yeah. And you had an offensive line that had every single player on that offensive line give up at least 3 pressures. Like that is insane. Every single guy on that offensive line, but we know who the main problems were during the regular season and how much that kind of overcompensating for the interior kind of weaknesses could have affected the guys on the outside as well. But how will the Chargers address it? And that's next. Will they go with the Greg Roman kind of philosophy, Jim Harbaugh philosophy, and keep doubling down on the trenches? I think Joe Ortiz's draft history might make you think they will still add skill players and spend pretty good resources on that. So we're going to get into all that and maybe some 2025 expectations and more on today's Locked On Chargers podcast. I love going to live events, whether it's sports, music, theater, or comedy. One of my favorite memories was attending a concert last year. I know I've told you guys before about getting some $18 tickets to a Blink-182 concert with an obstructed view, and I still got the energy and the excitement that were unforgettable. But the best part is I saw the panoramic 360 view of my seat and realized that even in an obstructed seat, technically, I still could see the stage perfectly, and it was awesome. But Game Time has now made it even easier to get tickets for your favorite live events with their new feature, Game Time Picks. This feature filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Recently, I was looking for tickets to an upcoming concert using the Game Time app, and with Game Time Picks, I found an amazing deal and could even see the view from my seat before buying. Like I was saying, the super deal was particularly impressive, offering great seats at unbeatable prices. Plus, the app's all-in pricing shows the total cost up front with no surprise fees at checkout. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time. All right, David, well, it's time to get into some more buy or sells here because there are a ton of Chargers overreactions and storylines to get into, but I do want to thank all the everydayers, especially the offseason everydayers who are still showing up even after a tough weekend and realizing, that there's a lot for this team to do and a lot for us to discuss during this offseason. We appreciate you making us your first listen as the only daily Chargers podcast and the only podcast that's going to be here with you through the entire offseason. We're not taking vacations now that football is over. It's still 5 shows a week. But if you need a second listen, make sure you guys check out the Locked On NFL slate with 2 shows a day as they get into everything around the league with hosts who cover their teams every single day on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast from. David, we have a good question here. I guess a good buy or sell from Brian, who says the Chargers buy or sell the Chargers doubling down, going more O-line centric and leaving tight end and wide receiver as a secondary concern going into next year, meaning high-end O-line draft and free agent signings and lower on the wide receivers and tight ends. Thanks, guys. Keep up the great stuff. Are you buying or selling that?
I'm going to sell it. And the reason why I'm going to sell it is because the Chargers are going to have the resources where they're not going to have to discriminate on who they go after. They're going to be able to be players immediately in free agency. And I mean, we've talked about it a couple of times, but they're going to have probably around $100 million in cap space. So why would, and also you just don't know who's going to get re-signed, who's going to be available, right? I mean, that's going to be the next step, right? They're going to be able to figure that out, but they're not going to have to be very selective. They're going to be able to go out and get whoever they want because they're going to have the kind of cap space that's going to, be able to make them players in any of those conversations. So yes, I highly expect that they will go into the offseason and try to get some of the best guards that they can with the money that they have available, which, like I've said, is very plentiful. But also, you need to look at the draft as well, because you have to look at positions that are going to be needed right now and needed in the near future. That's why you have to do this completely in the draft and free agency together.
Yeah, and I think what they're saying, though, is just like, I mean, I agree with you, but like you can't obviously give $20 million to 5 different players because then your salary cap's gone, right? And you still have plenty of holes to fill. So I think the big thing is just, okay, are they going to spend, you can't spend a high price on everything. You can't go get a high price edge rusher and guards and a center and wide receivers and a tight end. You can't, right? You are going to have to use the draft and decide where you want to spend those resources and how high of the draft picks you want to use on some of these positions. And I would say that, at least as far as, even though the Chargers did take Joe Alt with the 5th overall pick, and it's like, damn, okay, they went trenches, they had huge needs at wide receiver and all those things, they also did trade up for Ladd McConkey in the 2nd round. So they knew, and they just didn't do enough after that to keep building out that room and thought they could get more of the guys they had there, and they couldn't. But in Greg Roman's time in Baltimore with Joe Hortiz, obviously in that front office, right? In the 4 years he was the offensive coordinator there, 2 of those years they drafted wide receivers.
Yeah.
One of those years they drafted J.K. Dobbins in the 2nd round. None of those years they drafted an offensive lineman in the 1st round. It was Kyle Hamilton in one of those years at safety and then Patrick Queen at linebacker. So they will go try to keep adding weapons. But I think that, what Greg Roman and his need for wide receivers, we saw in year 1, they couldn't address everything. How much was they wanted to, or just being strapped, financially and with the draft picks that they had. But I think we could all say, there's so much, like, it's hard for me to say, hey, they shouldn't be spending premium resources on the interior, because you have a huge need there. And that's the thing, is they just have so many huge needs where it's like they do need to spend, premium on an offensive line. What I think most likely would be, hey, you got to at least take care of 2 of those positions and pay high-priced, proven talents on the interior in free agency, right? I don't think they're going to spend $30 million on a wide receiver like a T. Higgins, unfortunately, but we'll have that conversation because I think that they should very much consider it. But I do think, we have seen Joe Hortiz, and even in San Francisco, when Jim Harbaugh was there before, in the 4 years, they took an edge rusher, a wide receiver, a cornerback, and a safety. So it's not like these teams always just go trenches in the first round, historically under Harbaugh, and historically, at least with the Ravens, when Joe Hortiz was there. But let's get to this next one. We have another voicemail here, David, about what the Chargers' future looks like, and if this could potentially be, a one and done as far as the playoffs go, and if maybe they miss it in 2025.
Hey, David. Hey, Daniel. This is Isaac, man. Been a big fan of you guys' show for the past year or so. Went to the game on Saturday. Pretty heartbreaking to see the Bolts lose in that fashion. Are you or selling that we will make it back to the wild card next year, given with how good the Broncos are and given, of course, how good Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs are? I'm really optimistic, going forward. First year of this rebuild, we made it to the wild card. So I'm just curious if y'all buying or selling that.
David, buying or selling as we look at it right now, the Chargers will be back in the playoffs in 2025.
Back in the playoffs, I'm buying it. I'm selling that it's going to be the wild card, though. It's going to be the division, because they're going to go after the division in 2025. I think, given this offseason, they know what their issues are. They already well overperformed this year in the first year of a regime. Now this regime has carte blanche to be able to do whatever they want, bring in whoever they want, draft whoever they want. And I think, given those resources, they're going to be able to spearhead this thing straight to the AFC West division.
Hey, I love where your head's at for sure. I'm going to need some more kind of finer details on how exactly they're going to catch up to them, but it feels like there's a gap between them right now. And like I've said before, until they unseat the Chiefs in that division, I'm done calling for the Chargers to take the division. Go beat them in a regular season game first. But I do think that's the next step, right? If you want to beat good teams, you can't be surprised when you don't beat good teams in the playoffs, when you can't beat good teams in the regular season. And next year, they're going to have a lot more good teams because they're going to be playing a second place schedule, not a last place schedule, because you get matched up with whoever is second place in the other divisions that you have to play outside of them getting the AFC South next year, which I think is fortunate for them. But they also get the NFC East, where you have a couple of playoff teams that you're going to have to play, a juggernaut in the Philadelphia Eagles and an up-and-coming Washington Commanders team and a Dallas Cowboys team that'll have Dak back. So it's going to be a tougher schedule, in my opinion, next year, because there are 9 playoff teams, if you're including the Broncos and the Chiefs next season, which is why I think you might be a little crazy with this next voicemail.
Daniel, David, this is a fan favorite of the year, 2022. My bio associates, despite the heartbreaker loss in the playoffs, Coach Harbaugh and Justin Herbert will not lose another 6 games in the regular season. The rest of the time together. I'm buying it. I don't care who we play. What do you say? Thank you. Love you.
I think, again, I love the optimism. I think that, to me, 11 wins feels like it should be the floor, assuming this team keeps trending and building in the right direction. And if you won 11 games next year against a maybe much tougher schedule, that still could be considered a very, very good season. And the teams in your division are going to have to play some tough games as well. But I would have a hard time saying definitively that it'll be 12-5 or better from here on out. But I think you're hoping that they build into a team where that is the expectation.
Absolutely. I agree with you as well. I have a hard time just being able to flat out buy 12-5 going forward just because you just never know what's going to happen. There could be some catastrophic injuries that prevent that reality from, being something that could come to fruition. So
sure,
I just can't sit here in good conscience and say that that's a guarantee. I love where the direction of this organization is going. Don't get me wrong, but I just can't sit here and buy it completely.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, I think obviously this is assuming, you have Justin Herbert and Jim Harbaugh. That is the duo, right? And as long as you have them, the goal should always be the playoffs. And I do think that this team will be better in 2025, which is why I'm buying that they will be a wild card team in 2025. And I'm also buying that they, should have a floor of 11 wins going forward. They shouldn't be going backwards. They shouldn't be regressing. You could have a harder schedule and get the same amount of wins, and it could still be a really good season. And there's some teams that are going to fall off, right? If you're talking about the wild card, like the Steelers might not be that next year, what they were this year. They seem to be going and spiraling a little bit. We'll see if the Broncos, what they have is sustainable after kind of their weaknesses got very much exposed in the playoffs as well. Obviously, it feels like they're building something. It feels like they have a quarterback. Things can change year to year, right? We've seen many quarterbacks have their sophomore struggles as well. So there's a lot that goes into it, but I think that the expectation for this team every season now, as it should be, and why you go get Jim Harbaugh, is that you're in the playoffs. And now the expectation they didn't live up to was winning in the playoffs, and that we're going to have to wait, unfortunately, until 2025 to see. But who's going to be on this team in 2025? And that's where I want to go tomorrow, because Khalil Mack had some interesting statements at his end of season kind of press conference in the locker room, so press conference, where it seemed like he was very much mulling retirement. So will he retire? Is Joey Bosa for sure gone? These are things we're all going to be getting into on tomorrow's episode, so make sure you guys don't miss it by following or subscribing for free on the Locked On Chargers YouTube channel and listening wherever you get your podcast from. You can also find the show every day on all of our social media. On Twitter, at Locked On LAC, on Instagram, at Locked On Chargers, and our Locked On Chargers Facebook page. You can also find the show every day on my Twitter, at Dan Talk Sports, and David at Dro Talk SD, or call a 30-second voicemail into the Locked On Chargers voicemail line at 323-524-7924. So a lot of things not to overreact about right now. We're on to 2025, and I think there's a lot to be positive about. And I do think that with Justin Herbert, he is one of the things you should be least worried about, at least right now, right? Give him a team, give him an offense, and then we can start wondering if he's really that guy. But that's going to do it for today's show. Make sure you're back tomorrow when we talk about what is going to happen with Khalil Mack, who seems to be mulling retirement, and much more. But until then, take it easy and go Bolts.